What if I told you the most peaceful spot in your city was also its most dangerous? We've all seen them, those quiet stretches of water running through our towns and cities. But what happens when that quietness is shattered? Today, we're diving into a mystery behind a body found in a local canal. The scene was bizarre, the motive was murky, but it involved a medley of passion, jealousy and callousness. Welcome to Bradford Through the Lens, and this is the Canal Murder.
Today we're in Shipley and I'm speaking to you from Gallows Bridge, which goes over the canal here. And we're going to take you back to a grisly event in August 1898 where a man was killed on a boat. On Tuesday the 2nd of August 1898, a boat was moored here on the canal and it was called the Surprise. It was owned by Glovers of Bingley and captained by William Slingsby. And Peter Keeling worked on that boat which delivered coal up and down the canal. We're on Leeds Road in the Windhill area of Shipley. And if you was to look a bit further up there, you can see the beautifully restored former Carnegie Library. And a little further down the road there, you can see some land that's been redeveloped. Now that land used to be known as Lane Bottom. Back in 1898, a gentleman by the name of Joseph Croft lived here. He was a quarryman, 50 years old. He'd been separated from his wife for about 10 years. He had 2 children, but he lived here with a woman called Serena Jennings. Although described as being a man with, shall we say, temperate habits, Joseph Croft was also a respected man, and he seemed to be quite well liked by those who knew him. So in the early afternoon of Tuesday the 2nd of August 1898, Joseph Croft came to this building which was back then a pub called the Bull Inn, and behind it you can see steps there leading up to the canal. He met his partner here, Serena Jennings, and he told her, "I'm going to go up into Shipley," and she said to him, "Okay, but don't sup too much beer." So he left the Bull Inn and off he went up there. We're now a little nearer the centre of Shipley and I'm talking to you from Fox Corner. Now some of you might know that Fox Corner derived its name from a pub which used to stand right behind me. It was called the Fox and Hounds and it was on the corner of Commercial Street. So Joseph Croft made his way up here and he headed for the Fox and Hounds pub, where he met a couple of acquaintances by the name of Peter Keeling and Martha Schofield. Martha was actually an old flame of Joseph's. Now there was some speculation later on that during this drinking session, Joseph Croft became concerned for the safety and welfare of Martha Schofield. He was somehow under the impression that she was going to come to some harm at the hands of Peter Keeling. Overlooking the canal back then was a row of houses, and the properties were actually known as canal houses, and one of the occupants was a lady called Jane Whittingham. And at around 3 o'clock on that Tuesday afternoon, she said she could see from her door the Surprise boat, and on it was Peter Keeling and Martha Schofield, and they both appeared to be a little drunk. Jane also noticed that the couple appeared to be quarrelling. Peter Keeling jumped from the boat onto the canal bank and he said to Martha, "Stop there, I will not be long before I'm back," and then he went away. About 3/4 of an hour later, Jane went to the door and she noticed that Peter Keeling jumped onto the boat and he went into the cabin. She said that all was quiet for a few minutes, very quiet, and then she saw Peter Keeling put his head out of the cabin. She said that he actually climbed out onto the deck and said, "Come out, you bastard." Jane heard a man's voice answer from the cabin, "I can't." Peter Keeling then jumped down into the cabin in a very furious manner, and she said that the noise that followed was horrible, past bearing. It was terrible. She was asked what the sound was like, and she said it was like thumps. You could fancy, you could hear fire irons. It was dreadful. And she said that that noise went on for 3 or 4 minutes. About 5 minutes later, Peter Keeling jumped from the boat onto the bank, this time being followed by Martha. They actually passed another boat and a man was sat on it, and Keeling said to him, "I've catched him at last, I've done him his job, and I've given him something to go on with for 2 or 3 days. Peter and Martha walked across this area, which will have been back then the yard of the Bull Inn, and they saw that standing at the back door of the pub, which is, I guess, that blocked up entrance point there, they saw the landlady, Alice Wood, and a young man by the name of George Bedford. Now, George happened to be the nephew of Joseph Croft. But anyway, Peter asked Mrs. Wood if she'd seen Serena. Serena was, of course, the girlfriend of Joseph Croft. Mrs. Wood said she hadn't, and Peter says, "Well, tell her I've left him all right." And then they both went to the Fox and Hounds. Mrs. Wood was quite alarmed by that statement. She knew that something wasn't quite right with it, and so she sent George across to the surprise boat to see what was happening over there. George came straight over to the canal, and he climbed into the cabin of the surprise, and he was met with a truly ghastly sight. It was the body of Joseph Croft laying down in a pool of blood. George went straight back to the Bull Inn to tell the landlady what he'd seen aboard the boat, and the police were called. And police constables Ross and Maskell came. They went aboard the surprise and they found the body of Joseph Croft to be dead but still quite warm. Taking into account what they'd been told about Peter Keeling, they went into the centre of Shipley to find him. The 2 police constables came up here to the Fox and Hounds pub, where they found Peter Keeling and Martha drinking. As he attempted to arrest Peter Keeling, he said to them, "Let me sup my beer first." But anyway, they took him to the local police station. Here at the junction of Rosses Street is the site of the former police station of Shipley, and Schofield and Keeling were brought here. And when Keeling was informed that Joseph Croft had died, his response to that was, "Well, if the bastard isn't dead, he ought to be." During his incarceration in the cells at Shipley Police Station, Keeling was said to have lost the braggart and exultant spirit with which he published his ghastly deeds, and he was sullen and morose. On the 11th of August 1898, Peter Keeling and Martha Schofield were brought to the court here on Manor Row. But the occasion itself was quite exciting for other reasons, because Bradford's former hangman, James Berry, was also in the building applying for a transfer of licence to a public house in the Tong area. You'll recall earlier in the video I mentioned that Joseph Croft was of the opinion that Martha Schofield was going to come to some harm on the surprise boat. And the reason why he ended up on the boat that afternoon was indeed something of a mystery. And without there being a credible witness to the events that occurred on the boat, it was decided that Martha Schofield should be discharged and brought forward as a witness. And that's what happened. Martha Schofield gave her account. She corroborated part of Jane Whittingham's statement, the lady who had seen Peter Keeling leave the boat from her house at the side of the canal. Martha Schofield said it was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon and she heard somebody enter the cabin. She called out, "You haven't been gone long," and a male voice replied, "It's not Pete, it's me." She looked up and saw that it was Joseph Croft in the cabin and that he was expressing an intention of committing an impropriety, even if it was to cost him his life. But at that moment, Martha said Peter Keeling returned, and upon seeing Joseph Croft, he said, "Now then, have I got you this time?" A fight broke out between the two men, and they were stumbling around inside the cabin among the fire irons and against the corn bin. Martha said she told them to stop fighting, and Joseph Croft sat down and asked for a drink of water. Martha said she got dressed and that her and Peter left the cabin. Joseph Croft was still sat down. Peter Keeling also gave his own defence here at the court. He corroborated the version of events that had been put forward by Martha Schofield, and he added further details. He described Joseph Croft as a bigger and heavier man than himself, and he referred to a knife on the locker and how Joseph Croft had said, "I'll knife you, you bastard, if I can get hold of that knife." Further evidence was provided. Dr. Carter detailed the results of the post-mortem examination of Joseph Croft's body. He said there were 35 wounds on the face and head, but no marks of violence on the trunk and extremities. He said there were 2 fractures of the skull, either of which were sufficient enough to cause death. The charge of manslaughter was brought against Peter Keeling at the courtroom in Leeds Town Hall on Tuesday, the 13th of December, 1898. Keeling said he'd lived with Martha Schofield for 5 months, but he'd known Joseph Croft all his life. He said on the morning of that Tuesday, he'd seen Joseph Croft come off the boat, and when he asked him about it, Joseph Croft said he didn't mean anything by it. He said that later on in the afternoon, about 3:45, he was returning to the boat and he heard Martha scream. He jumped into the cabin and Joseph Croft allegedly said, "There's me or thee for it," i.e. Martha could only belong to one of them. And then a fight began. Keeling said there was a bread knife on the locker, and Joseph Croft had said, "I'll knife you if I can get hold of that." Joseph also said he would kick Peter Keeling's insides out. Speaking on behalf of Peter Keeling was a Mr. Newell. He addressed the jury and asked them to take into account the great provocation that Keeling alleged had happened inside the cabin. And he also asked them to consider that Joseph Croft's injuries had not been caused by blows from Peter Keeling, but from falling against the iron stove in the cabin. However, the jury found Peter Keeling guilty of manslaughter, and he was committed to penal servitude for 10 years. Joseph Croft's widow, Martha, lived here on Mary Street in Saltaire at number 18. Martha Croft paid quite a moving tribute to her husband when speaking to the local press. She said, "Oh Joe, I had hoped to live to see the day when you would return to a respectable life, but you are the same to me now as you always were, my dear husband, and I pray Almighty God to forgive you for all you have done. Every night and morning I've prayed for you." Martha went on, "My firm belief is that he could have conquered his craving for drink, and he would have lived a respectable life with me and his family. A better and kinder husband, apart from the drink, could not have been wished for. And now he is dead, and oh, what a death. If I could only have seen him on his bed of sickness and seen him repent his past life. But that cannot be. But he is still my husband, and whatever I have to do it, I will bury him as such. And in death, I freely forgive him, as I hope God will do, for all he has done." And so to conclude our look back at the events of August 1898 on the Canal in Shipley, we've brought you to Nabwood Cemetery. and to the final resting place of the victim, Joseph Croft. And here it is. It's quite a weathered looking gravestone, and it's quite hard to read, but you can just make out the wording. It looks like a family grave. So it says, in loving memory of Joseph Croft of Saltaire, who died August the 2nd, 1898, aged 50 years. Now there is quite a tragic story on this headstone, because immediately below Joseph's name you can see here an inscription, also John, the son of Joseph and Martha Croft, who died 21st of September 1898, aged 26 years. So John, who was Joseph's son, died about 7 weeks after his father did. We've no information as to why he died. You know, was it an accident, was it illness? But, you know, that really must have been quite a hard time for poor Martha Croft. But she's also buried here, along with the other son and his wife. Rest in peace, Joseph.